Okay, guys. So our speaker is Craig Brown, Dr. Craig Brown. It's an associate professor at Dalhousie University's Department of Oceanography. Dr. Brown specializes in the geospatial analysis of benthic ecosystem using marine acoustic remote sensing. His research aims to understand seafloor ecosystems for fisheries and conservation management, combining ecological, geological, geophysical, and oceanographic data. He holds a bachelor honors in geology and a PhD in marine ecology. Dr. Brown has worked in the UK and Canada and currently leads the Seascape Ecology and Map SEAM laboratory at Dalhousie University since 2019. I hope you all guys enjoyed it, and by the end, you're going to open up for questions. Great, all yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you for coordinating today. Thanks to CCOM for the invitation to come down and present. It's been great to visit. It's been a few years since I've been down here. It's like drinking from a fire hydrant. There's so much information, so much great research goes on here. It's really been nice today to connect with so many people. I will clarify, my undergraduate's actually in zoology, not geology. You'll hear a lot about geology here. I feel like a jack of all trades and expert in none these days. So we are going to be talking about ecosystems and seafloor habitat mapping, which is a field that I stumbled into in the late 1990s, working with analog side scan, single beam systems. I've stayed in that through various positions in the UK and Canada since then. So I'm going to showcase a little bit of a hot look of projects today, which I hope will be of interest to this audience. So my interests are really around the where, why, and when questions regarding seafloor biology. That's really what drives my research interests. Trying to understand the spatial patterns that occur in benthic species distributions. So where are they? What are the abiotic and biotic drivers of those patterns? How do those patterns change over time? So we very much work in the applied science space. We do a lot of work around marine conservation, NPA mapping. We do work with fisheries. We do work around benthic monitoring. So I have a strong interest in tools and techniques, applying the latest ocean floor mapping technologies to understand those patterns and improve the way that we can study, map, and monitor the ecological patterns on the seafloor and better understand those processes. So today what I would like to do is just start with some background information on what is seafloor habitat mapping. We've just got a review published that I thought would be interesting to this audience, showing how that field has changed over the last 3 decades. And there's been quite a tremendous rate of change in the discipline. I'm going to talk mostly around one of the large projects that I lead, funded through the Ocean Frontier Institute, the BECOME project, benthic ecosystem mapping and engagement. I don't have time to show everything, so it really just be some of those highlights. Examples of broad scale mapping, fine scale mapping, and a little bit about backscatter, which is an area that my lab actively works on, and then some concluding remarks. So really what we've seen as the mapping technology has come online over the last few decades is this emerging field of seascape ecology. So it's very analogous to landscape ecology, using satellite remote sensing to understand landscape patterns. Once you have that spatial information about the environment, that can really help you understand how species utilize the environment around them. What are the spatial patterns? Why do we see certain organisms in certain places? So seascape ecology is really the marine-centric counterpart to landscape ecology. And the mapping is really what underpins that. I like this term benthoscape. Benthoscape is really the benthic component of the seascape. Seascape includes the overlying pelagic environment, but we focus very much looking at the seabed environment. We defined this in a paper back in 2012 as the minimum mapping unit or grain at which distinctive biophysical characteristics can be identified and mapped. So we're kind of blending together the geology and the biology. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're using that concept to understand the seafloor environment. We take a satellite remote sensed image or an aerial image of an environment. It's pretty easy to see how we can divide that landscape into different landscape classes. We can draw polygons around them. We could do that manually. We could use a GIS multispectral image to classify it if we wanted. But you can conceptually see that we've got different areas there that represent different landscape classes. On land, really easy. We can go and walk through there. We can give them labels using whatever type of terminology we want. Arable landscape class, pastoral landscape class, urban habitat, woodland landscape unit. Those are our broad defining biophysical patterns on land, and we can use that to understand the differences in the ecology, whatever component of the ecology we're interested in. So if you're interested in leaf litter invertebrate communities, you'd go and sample inside the landscape class that you're likely going to find that environment. Sounds pretty obvious. But as oceanographers and ocean scientists, often it's like the analogy of flying in a hot air balloon above the clouds, and you're trying to sample those leaf litter communities, but you don't have a map. Most of the ocean isn't mapped to that resolution. So you're trying to sample those invertebrates, you have no idea where you're collecting it. So the mapping piece is really what can help us understand the ecology once we have that spatial information. And of course, there's a lot of complexities there in terms of the data that we use to make those maps, the resolution of those data sets, and how we're understanding, segmenting, classifying, making those benthic maps. So in ecology, the spatial context is everything. And now as an ecologist, I can't really work without a map. That spatial information is so vital. So what we've done recently, back in 2011, I published a review on benthic habitat mapping, focusing on acoustic remote sensing methods, where we talked about some of those developments over the previous 10 years to this publication. The field's changed so much since 2011 that we thought it was time to go back. So we recently undertook a review. I did this in collaboration with a postdoc in my lab, Ben Miziuk. And we wanted to revisit the field and look at how the field has changed since this publication. So we revisited those questions. What is benthic habitat mapping? How is it accomplished now? How has that changed over time? And we've certainly seen a lot of changes since this paper. The field has grown tremendously. I should give Ben credit for most of this. He went through these papers and systematically categorized and looked at some of the trends and changes that's happened. We wanted an unbiased sample of the literature, so we used the search terms benthic habitat mapping. That returned 1,316 papers. So the field has moved on tremendously since the 2011 publication. But we sifted that down. We wanted to try and really just pick out the key papers. So to qualify for the review, the publication had to include a benthic habitat map product. So something like a distribution or habitat suitability of a single taxa, morphotaxa, groups of taxa, functional groups, physical habitat structure, or habitat forming substrates or habitat surrogates. So it had to be habitat focused, couldn't be just a geological map. And that helped us thin down the return literature. It had to have a spatially continuous map, so not just spatially discrete point observations. And maps published and reviewed in multiple studies were only counted once. It's a qualifying map. And that got us down to 624 publications that we used and analyzed and reviewed. In comparison, back in 2011, there was only 147 papers that we used in a similar study. So it shows the increase in publications in this field. And we went through and systematically categorized various things we were interested in. So there's lots of different types of habitat information that we might want to display, a thematic type of maps. And I'm going to come on to that in a moment. We've categorized it using the response variable. I'm going to come up with 4 categories of seafloor habitat map. We looked at how the maps were produced, modeling approach. We looked at the remote sensing technology, whether it was acoustic or optical, the platforms that we used to collect that data. We looked at the type of predictor data being used, and other relevant information that we thought might be useful. And I'm just going to show you some of the statistics to show how that field has changed. To start with, though, we felt the definition back in 2011 hadn't changed. We simplified it a little bit. This is what our definition of benthic habitat mapping is: spatially continuous prediction of biological patterns on the seafloor. That kind of sums everything up. But there are different thematic types of maps that we make. So, we start off, we're interested in some component of the seafloor habitat that we wish to capture on map spatially. That's our response variable. That's usually what we measure with our ground validation, whether it's a physical sample or a photograph of the seabed. We're going to extract some information about the benthic habitat, whether it's substrate type, a single species observation, or looking at the community composition of the seafloor. Those are discrete measurements. We bring in our geospatial data, whatever that might be, whether it's a satellite image if we're in shallow water, or whether it's a bathymetry layer, a backscatter layer, or derivatives of the bathymetry to help us understand those biological patterns and extrapolate those point observations spatially across an area. That's our map-making approach. How do we do that integration? We've seen tremendous advances in machine learning methods in particular over the last 10 years in how we integrate all that information. And ultimately, that drops out our habitat map, our thematic map at the end. So the term habitat map is used pretty ambiguously, but we can really start to distill it down based on the response variable that we're interested in. And we actually started to look at the patterns across these 600 plus papers and say, well, we could use a response variable to classify the type of thematic output. So we take this as our hypothetical benthic environment that we're interested in, this image here. It's got substrate, it's got different types of biology. There's lots of different thematic elements we might wish to try and capture in a map. So we could start by looking at just the abiotic components that can act as a proxy to help us understand those habitat spatial differences. So something like a substrate map can act as a proxy for understanding seafloor habitat and those species distribution. We could bring in physical oceanographic information or seabed morphology or other components of the abiotic environment that can help us understand habitat differences spatially. Or we could just focus in on a single species. So, for example, we could just focus in on the sponges in this particular area. And this, to me, is the truest definition of a habitat. It's a place where an organism lives. It's a species-specific term. And we can use those abiotic parameters or predictor layers to actually model the distribution of a particular species, basically mapping its ecological niche spatially based on those variables. It can be depicted as a presence-absence, where you're likely to find that species, or as a probability of occurrence. How suitable is that environment through space for that particular organism? Some studies will actually look at the entire biological assemblage together. How does that composition of species change spatially across an area? So this is also bringing in some of the ecological processes that are taking place that are changing the composition of the biology through space. So lots of different examples of this: mapping biodiversity patterns, looking at functional traits, or other components of the benthic ecosystem will fall into a community-based type habitat map. And then finally, our fourth class, what I call benthoscape. A lot of the habitat classification schemes like UNIS, CMAX, other ones around the world are actually bringing and blending together the biological and physical elements of the seafloor into a class which you try and then depict spatially. So, we can use those four categories of response variable for our four different types of thematic maps. We can look how they've changed through time over the last, well, here we've just displayed it from 2020. There wasn't an awful lot done in terms of spatial mapping of benthic habitats before then. What you're seeing on all the graphs that I'm going to show on the left-hand axis is the proportion of publications per year that fall into that category. And on the right-hand axis is the absolute number of publications. And we see about 40 to 60% of all habitat mapping studies are mapping benthoscape as the thematic output. Abiotic surrogates, again, about 20% of papers are using that as a proxy for habitat. What we've seen happen is really, more focus on single biota mapping, using things like species distribution modeling methods that have come online, really more in the last 10 years than it was before then. And similarly with community mapping, same sort of thing. The tools weren't there earlier on. We're now starting to see those methods come online. When we look at geospatial data, we looked at everything from satellite remote sensing in shallow water. There's a lot of seascape and benthic habitat mapping work done in shallow water using these techniques versus when we get deeper, the use of acoustic remote sensing methods for understanding and mapping benthic ecosystems. We can start to look at the breakdown across the literature. About, again, between 40 and 60% by year. There's pretty even balance between acoustic and optical studies in the literature. Compiled, really that is where we're looking at data streams like JEDCO, which are using both satellite-derived bathymetry validated with acoustic methodologies. So using multiple data streams to generate our predictive variables for the mapping. And again, we see that there was very few studies using compiled data sources like JEDCO in the early 2000s. As those open access data sets have come online, a lot of studies are picking them up for benthic habitat mapping applications. We're focusing just on the acoustic remote sensing technologies. Not surprisingly, in the early 2000s, not many habitat mapping studies were using multi-beam. It just wasn't available. We start to see that really take off around 2005, and now about 60 to 80% of habitat mapping studies that use acoustic remote sensing are using multi-beam. Interesting as well, things like single beam echosounders. A lot of the early habitat mapping work was using single beam acoustic ground discrimination systems like Roxanne, QTC View. That's how I started back in the late 1990s. But those have died off as multi-beam has become more popular. So we see some interesting trends and projections across the different tools. Bathymetry and acoustic backscatter, not surprisingly, a lot of data sets are using that. And when we say acoustic backscatter here, it's not just multi-beam backscatter. A lot of the early studies back in the early 2000s were single beam systems that are using the backscatter response to categorize and understand the benthic habitats. And certainly with the advent and widely available multi-beam bathymetry data sets, what we're also seeing now is the popular use of terrain derivatives from the multi-beam bathymetry. So calculating things like seabed slope, orientation, curvature, roughness, these are all great proxies for understanding changes in the biology. So a lot of studies now will take your digital elevation model from bathymetry data sets and derive all these different terrain attributes at different spatial scales to better understand the ecology. In terms of the modeling methods, a lot of the early work was manual interpretation. We take our multi-beam, we take our backscatter, we digitize and draw polygons around the different areas. Still a perfectly valid way. You're using your knowledge to actually delineate and segment into polygons of different habitat features. But really what we've seen happen are the really big rise in empirical supervised modeling methods. So as we've got geospatial statistical methods coming online, they've really been taken up by the habitat mapping community. And if we drill in and start looking at some of the different, again, this is overwhelming now, there's so many different tools that are being used for actually modeling the habitat features using these underlying geospatial data sets. For new grad students coming in, like, well, which tool should I use? A random forest model? Should I use a maximum entry model? There's been a proliferation, certainly in the last 10 years, of all these different methods. And some of them are really successful now in helping us understand and basically extrapolate that response variable spatially on our predictor variables to generate habitat maps. So that's really kind of one of the things we've looked at is that trajectory over time. We now have some great tools. We've got great geospatial data sets. Our understanding of how we can model benthic ecosystem characteristics has improved so much over that last 20 years. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're applying some of those approaches in a project that I co-lead with a colleague at Memorial University. This is funded through the Ocean Frontier Institute, CCOM project, Benthic Ecosystem Mapping and Engagement. And this is focused around the use and understanding of, spatially, of benthic ecosystems and how ocean climate is changing. We're seeing a lot of shifts in species distributions caused by climate change. Bottom waters tend to be warming. We're seeing species migrate poleward, but they can only do so if there's suitable habitat for them to move into. Often we don't know where that habitat is because we don't have the seafloor mapping data sets for the vast majority of the ocean floor. So the BECOME project is really trying to address that question. What role does benthic habitat play in controlling those shifting patterns in species and biodiversity? So a lot of recent studies have started to demonstrate that there's predicted poleward migration of many marine species. It's a complex situation. The biology is driven by a complex interaction of biotic and abiotic factors that influence how a species is going to respond to those climate changes. And that has follow-on implications for benthic ecosystem health, how they function, how resilient they are to climate change. You can completely change the ecosystem structure through these species movements. And many of these studies to date, they've all shown these poleward migrations, but very few of them have brought in benthic habitat information or even detailed bathymetry information to see how those projections might change. And that's really due to a lack of fine resolution benthic maps. So we really need to bring that information in. And the Northwest Atlantic is a hotspot for climate change. Water temperatures are warming really fast. In Atlantic Canada, we've a $3 billion annual fishery, most of which is around benthic shellfish, scallop, lobster, surf clam. They're all going to be vulnerable to change. How are they going to change over time? Some of these are static species that can't move. What's going to happen in terms of will they move northward? Can they move northward? Is there suitable habitat? And a lot of those questions are unknown. I don't even have to explain this to this audience. You show this, most people think, oh yeah, we've got great mapping data over the entire ocean floor. No, we don't. This is 500-meter pixel resolution JEPCO data. Really, we're interested in the fine scale habitat characteristics that drive a lot of these species patterns. And over the vast majority of this part of the globe, we don't have this type of information. And this is just bathymetry. I'm going to get onto backscatter later. We really need to understand the geology, not just the bathymetry. That's really what we need to understand, how these ecosystems will change and what will happen with these poleward migrations, if that's going to happen to a lot of these species. So spatial resolution is going to be really important. We might be able to use this probe, 500-meter pixel resolution data sets if we're looking over the entire Northwest Atlantic. But the devil's in the detail when you start looking at where these species are residing. We really need higher resolution data to be able to understand where these organisms are going to reside and how those spatial patterns are going to change. So we put together the project. It's a multi-year, multi-million-dollar project. We wanted to work across different spatial scales. We wanted to try and mine and utilize as many different data streams as possible. So we're doing everything from broad scale projections using global bathymetric data sets, where we have it, finer scale, multi-beam data, and backscatter from areas that are well mapped. We're exploring new technologies, synthetic aperture sonar, 3-centimeter resolution, working with industry partners to see what addition that can help us understand those ecosystems, photogrammetry and video data sets. A lot of our scientific knowledge doesn't go back that far in terms of where the species were. So we've even got social scientists working on integrating other knowledge forms into understanding species occurrences tapping into indigenous knowledge and local ecological knowledge from the fishing industry? And can we integrate that into our thematic maps that we're making in terms of presence and observations of those fauna? All those different thematic elements that I talked about, different types of maps that we might need to generate at different spatial scales, ultimately to help decisions to support effective ocean stewardship and management. We're working very closely with a lot of our industry partners and government partners in this project. We structured the project around 8 work packages. I'm not going to go into detail, I don't have time, but we've got social science work packages, working with communities to try and capture alternative knowledge forms in terms of species occurrences and how do we feed that into our mapping process. We're looking at broad scale and fine scale. I'm going to show you a few examples of the types of maps we're making. And then with some sort of technology and data analysis work packages led by a whole bunch of great people at Dal and Memorial University leading each of these work packages. A large army of postdocs and grad students that make all this work happen. So I just wanted to acknowledge them. And then a lot of industry partners and external partners to the project as well, from academia, from our government agencies, from industry, and from non-profits. So these are all instrumental in making this big project work. So this is where the potluck of examples comes in. I'm just going to show you some of the types of projects we're working on. So at the broad spatial scale, we can think about abiotic surrogates. That's really that's the thematic type of map that we're thinking about here. If we're looking at shelf-wide changes, the geology is super important. And we do have geological maps on the shelf. These have been updated recently, 2022. This is a Geological Survey of Canada output. A lot of it is really just updating a lot of the existing maps. They've all been generated through expert interpretation, not necessarily bringing in some of the new data streams that we have. So we wanted to see if we could do this in a different way and whether that could add value to our understanding of the benthic habitats. So we've been looking at some of these new machine learning models, random forest being one of them. And again, I'm not going to dig into the weeds here. If anyone's interested in these specifics, just shoot me an email. But these are great tools. It's a machine learning approach. You can put in your discrete observations, your response variables. In this case, we were looking at legacy data from the Geological Survey of Canada, grain size measurements. There's 10,000 samples on the Scotian shelf collected over, well, probably since the 1960s. Could we utilize that information on grain size and bring in as many up-to-date predictor data, these continuous layers, things like Jebco bathymetry, terrain derivatives, things like slope, ruggedness, all the terrain derivatives that can be important, along with physical oceanographic variables. We've been using current magnitude and direction from model output from BIO, the Bedford Institute of Oceanography North Atlantic model. They've got models across the North Atlantic at a fairly coarse resolution. And the Geological Survey now has some really great models of seafloor shear velocity and wave power that they've generated and recently published just in the last couple of years. So we wanted to throw all this into the pot and see whether we could run a random forest model to predict over broad spatial scales some of those sediment abiotic surrogates that we're interested in. So whether that's categorical classes, like folk classes, or whether it's actually some of the grain size measurements, like the mean grain size or percentage, mud, sand, gravel. Random forest is flexible enough, it can do both categorical or continuous variable modeling. So this is the work of Esther Bouchouef, who's a master's student in my lab, just to show you some of the sample distributions. And we've got pretty good coverage on the Scotian shelf. We haven't got much off, so we didn't really extend the mapping to that area. And likewise, as we go north, very few physical samples of the seafloor geology. So this was our study area. Of course, physical samples don't capture the hard bottom, so we've also brought in photographs where there's bedrock and hard substrate. And we've ran random forest models for both of these using those predictive variables. This is one of the output maps. This is the folk classified output, and we're quite pleased with it. Our accuracy scores look a little bit on the low side, about 60% we're getting for this folk classification. Keep in mind, we're trying to link core to a 500 meter pixel. The broad patterns are there. We've shown this to the Geological Survey and the folks who actually made that initial map, and they were actually quite surprised how well this has worked across the region. We've done similar things in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This is another student in my lab, Emily Sklar. The last time any sort of substrate mapping was done in the Gulf of St. Lawrence was 1971. Loring and Noda collected 1,500 samples and did an interpreted superficial geology map of that area. That data wasn't even available. Emily went into the Geological Survey. The data, for some reason, never ended up in her archive. She went through cardboard boxes, back to the lab books, and we actually salvaged about 250 of those grain size measurements from this area. And we wanted to, again, use the same predictive variables that Esther used on the Scotian Shelf in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So global bathymetry, JEPCO, and the same BIO North Atlantic modeled current speed, direction, magnitude, wave shear, all those variables we put in. This is the original Loring and Noda map. They didn't have access to any of that added spatial information. It's basically an interpolation of a lot of their point sample observations. Those are Emily's random forest outputs. So it's working really well. This one on the lower right is our folk classification. These are percentage sand, gravel, mud. Again, really pleased with the way this is working. We're hoping that this will now feed into some of our species distribution modeling. These can be great predictive variables going forward to help us understand some of the biological distributions across this region, and that's going to form part of Emily's PhD. We've also done similar things with morphology, again, using objective statistical-based modeling of geomorphic, or I should say morphological features across these areas, which can also be very good for understanding the benthic ecology. Switching gears a little bit and thinking about the biology, again, broad scale, single species focus. So this is looking at sea cucumber habitat. This is a commercial species that's fished on the Scotian Shelf. We're starting to work very closely with colleagues in the math and stats department. So Joanna Mills-Fleming is a statistician who is developing the latest generation of stock assessment models for fisheries. Stock assessment models would traditionally just draw a fisheries polygon, which they're managing, and they would assume that the bottom is suitable across that polygon when they do their population modeling, which we know is not the case. Biology is patchily distributed. Often there's only a small percentage of the bottom that's suitable for some of these benthic fishery species. So these new state space models that the stats folks are working on are bringing in environmental covariates into that modeling process. So they're actually pulling in some of our mapping layers to better model the species distributions. So this is work that one of Joanna's students, Nathan Hebert, has been doing through the OFI Become project. And it's using the same predictive variables that Esther was using, JEPCO bathymetry, some of the terrain derivatives on current speeds, wave modeled information, to actually look at the spatiotemporal differences in the population of sea cucumber across the shelf. And we're seeing some really nice outputs. This work is almost published. It'll be out hopefully very soon, where we're nailing the habitat. They're looking at the population changes spatially. And that mapping information has been critical to understanding some of these trends. Talked a lot about bathymetry. I really think the backscatter is the more important part for understanding benthic habitat. So my lab's done a lot of work over the last few years. Call it, falling down the backscatter rabbit hole. For me, about 15 years ago, working with folks from CCOM and elsewhere, that was really a watershed moment where I realized there's still so much work to be done in extracting information from the backscatter signal to help us understand the benthic habitat. And it's that proxy and that use for grain size. So these are just some recent publications. We've done some work looking at bulk shift methods. How do you integrate legacy data? We've got examples I'm going to show from Bay of Fundy. Trying to use the latest off-the-shelf tools, which are widely available, things like FMGT to process the backscatter, but then how do you integrate a patchwork quilt of different sonar systems to model habitats over broader geographic areas like the Bay of Fundy? So these are tools that Ben Mizia, my postdoc, has been working on quite successfully. And we've also been very interested in multispectral backscatter as well, with the emergence of systems that are now collecting multiple frequencies with a single pass of the vessel. And these can all provide really valuable information about the habitats. Here we go. Let's go back a little. Have a delay here. 1 second. Okay. So this is work that Ben Miziuk's been doing. So again, we're narrowing down now to more fine-scale mapping where we have multi-beam data. We've had a project going on in the Bay of Fundy for a number of years. We've been out ground validating with drop camera systems. We've been trying to integrate and utilize all the legacy data from this area collected by the Canadian Hydrographic Service and UNB. John was involved in some of this data collection and seeing how we can utilize it to understand benthic ecosystems in the Bay of Fundy. Bathymetry, we've got great bathymetry data layers, but the backscatter is a challenge. We've used our bulk shift method. I'm not going to go into the details on that today. It's published, the papers are available, but we've been trying to harmonize that data into a layer that we can then integrate with all our ground truthing across the whole bay and see how we can predict things like grain size and then hopefully benthic habitat and single species distribution models in the bay. So Ben is interested in looking and modeling some of the grain size information from legacy GSC data, the Geological Survey of Canada. So we've got a lot of physical samples and measurements of percent composition of grain size, mean grain size, sorting coefficients, kurtosis and skewness of the samples. Can we bring these response variables in with our predictive variables and model those characteristics across the whole bay? One of the things that's always been missing is the physical oceanography. It's intrinsically linked with the grain size distributions. And it's really critical for understanding the benthic ecology. Different species probably aren't responding directly with the seafloor variables. It's the overlying water column that's bringing the food and supplying the larvae. And often there's been a mismatch in modeled physical oceanographic variables in the multi-beam. We're mapping meter or tens of meters resolution with our seafloor mapping data, but the physical oceanography is only available at kilometer scale resolutions. So it's not really a good match. So we've been working with Dr. Ian Church, who leads the ocean mapping group at UNB. They've been downscaling physical oceanographic models to super high resolution that we've been then integrating with our modeling. So they're down to 10 meters in some places in the Bay of Fundy. So we're seeing a much closer alignment with the resolution of the overlying physical oceanography with our backscatter bathymetry information. So these are the predictive variables that Ben has been bringing into his latest models looking at these grain size distributions. And I'm not going to even start to try and explain what's in these, but these are convolutional neural nets. Ben is a great data scientist. He's been bringing in the bathymetry, backscatter, a lot of those predicted physical oceanographic models, looking at different analysis windows because the scale that you're calculating a lot of these variables is important to understand the processes. He's also been bringing in spatial information about how spatially autocorrelated some of those sample locations are that can also add valuable information in terms of understanding the patterns, and then running them through a convolutional neural net to predict those variables spatially. And these are the outputs. This has been working incredibly well in the Bay of Fundy. Really pleased with this. So you can see percentage clay, silt, gravel, sand, and some of the other variables that the convolutional neural net is looking across all those predictive variables to actually model spatially these variables across the whole Bay of Fundy. Accuracies are pretty good. We're quite pleased with the way that the models are performing. You know, in our next step, this paper we've submitted to marine geology. We can use all of these as, again, further spatial prediction variables for our benthic habitat information, looking at species distributions. So we've 300 camera stations, we've observations of scallop, lobster, horse mussel, which we now want to feed all these predictive variables in with our observational data from where these species are and start modeling those species distributions across the bay. And last example that I'm going to give is our work on multispectral backscatter. So a few years ago, in partnership with R2 Sonic and QPS, we did some work in the Bedford Basin looking at multispectral systems. So the R2 Sonic system basically interleaves different frequency pings as the vessel moves forward. So we're getting different frequencies from 100 kilohertz to 400 kilohertz. And this is, again, exciting from a benthic ecology perspective, a little bit like a multispectral satellite image when you're thinking about landscape mapping. There's potentially a lot of valuable information in here to help us understand the species distributions in some environments, not all. Sometimes, you know, the frequency range here isn't tremendous, but in some situations like the Bay of Fundy, you can certainly see differences. So this early work in the Bay of Fundy, across those three frequencies, you can see on the 100 kilohertz, these high backscatter features. This is all dredge spoil that's been dumped in the Bedford Basin at some point in the history of Halifax being built and overlaid with soft sediment as it's been filled into the Bedford Basin. Those soft sediment areas, and we've ground truthed this extensively, taking cores here where we're getting differences versus here where the backscatter is uniformly low. And in the uniformly low area across our three frequencies, we're getting full penetration of a core down to 50 centimeters. On here, we're getting about 10 centimeters penetration before it hits the gravel. So we're seeing different penetrations of those frequencies. So we've been using the multispectral to see how we can apply it for habitat mapping. So this is work that we did last year. As part of the OFI Become project, we went out and we mapped Sambro Bank, which is a sponge conservation area. So these are Russian hat sponges. These features that you're seeing here, these are about a meter high. They're glass sponges. They have particular habitat preferences. And this is a closure to protect those sponges from bottom contact fishing. This area had never been mapped. There's some ground validation there, but they'd never looked spatially as to where those sponges occur, other than from discrete point samples with an ROV. So we went and mapped this area with an R2 Sonic multispectral system. We did drop camera work, which you're seeing here, a fairly small number of sample locations. And then one of my students, Sam Cutcliffe, who was an honor student last year, went through the video. He analyzed the video for georeferenced all the sponges. We extracted information about the benthic ecology. We did full species IDs on the video, and we can start to look at the biological patterns in connection with our multi-beam mapping data. And then what Sam did, he ran a benthic species distribution model. This was a generalized linear mix model using bathymetry and our three backscatter variables, and to generate a probability map of where we're finding the Vizela sponges. And this was our output map. Not surprising, the sponges like the hard bottom, but we're seeing actually the hard bottom, we're getting veneers of mud as we come down the slopes of Sambro Bank. And the sponges can actually tolerate a little bit of sediment, but can still attach. So I think this has worked so well because these different frequencies, some of them are punching through that thinner veneer of mud, and we're picking out that harder material underneath. And that's actually helping us understand the spatial distribution of the species on the bank. we're really like 90% accuracy of our models. It's working really well in understanding the distribution. So we're providing these data layers to DFO, which they can then use to help. We're seeing a lot of primary Vizela habitat outside the conservation area. These areas have never been mapped. Hopefully this will help them revise some of their NPA boundaries for this particular environment. I think I'm probably out of time. Just some concluding remarks. I think the review definitely demonstrated just how far the field of benthic habitat mapping has come over the 3 decades. I've witnessed that firsthand through that period, starting with analog side scan, doing a lot of AI interpretations to the kinds of sophisticated analysis that we're now doing. A lot of that's been driven by the technology. I've seen so many great examples going around CCOM today of how that technology is being innovated all the time and advanced. That's driving the field forward tremendously. There's been a lot of cross-fertilization with satellite remote sensing methods as well. We've seen really great cross-pollination of those fields. And what we're starting to see is benthic habitat mappers using a more diverse range and combination of data sets to help understand those patterns. Physical oceanography is critical. We've known that for a long time, but we're now starting to get the downscale physical oceanographic models that are helping us understand those ecosystem patterns. Still a lot of outstanding challenges. A lack of mapping. Scotian Shelf, we've still got vast areas where we don't have any multi-beam, and that's really slowing us down in terms of understanding these patterns. Fisheries, population dynamics, we're now seeing bringing in these variables with a lot of success. We need more high-resolution data. How do we deal with temporal change? That climate change question, we've just started to scratch the surface with the OFI Become project. How that's going to project forward. Do we need to remap some of these areas, or can we use legacy data sets of areas that are mapped because the geology isn't changing as fast as the ecology, and some of these questions are unknown. I mentioned integration of physical oceanographic data sets. We don't have downscale models for a lot of these areas. Where we do have them now is providing a lot of value in understanding these patterns. And then, data volumes. Not a unique problem. Lots of people are aware of the challenges. I didn't show any examples, but we're starting to work with things like synthetic aperture sonar. Do we really need to map at 3 centimeter resolution? The data volumes are enormous. It's really hard to run some of these machine learning methods on these absolutely massive data sets. It's challenging. How do we deal with those data volumes? I think I'll stop there. Just to acknowledge, our funding agencies for a lot of this research and all the great people that I work with. This is, very interdisciplinary stuff. Couldn't be done through a lot of collaboration with colleagues from across a whole range of disciplines. Thanks for your attention.
A lot of the seafloor that you showed in mapping is highly bimodal, from small pebbles to mud. The combinations, and most of your predictive models were for a grain size or a composition. How are you dealing with the fact that a lot of it's bimodal rather than a single size that you present?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the more we've looked at these modeling methods, but the Bay of Fundy was a good example. I think in that situation, that approach has worked really well with the data sets that we have from that area. I don't think we've done anything specific to address that. We've explored a variety of different tools and ways to analyze it. Yeah, I think that's, it's not an easy answer to that.
It's a problem.
It's a problem. Yeah. We see a lot of similar challenges in all the areas we work on in these glaciated environments. We've got soft deposit material in the troughs. We've got hard material higher up. Yeah, it's not easy.
Fabulous stuff there, but I'm curious though, you show why this should be done, but you've also worked with the federal government in Canada. Is any of this changing the way the federal government's work? Are they going to actually do acquisition? Are they going to change the way they acquire? Or are you talking to deaf ears?
That's a loaded question. I wonder if they're online. Maybe we can mute the mic and give a political answer or an honest answer. I hope it's making a difference. There's been a big push, mostly on the conservation side. You know, the mandates come down from the federal government. 2030, 30% of the ocean needs to be protected. So there's a scramble to draw polygons in areas of sensitive ecosystems. We don't have the data to support that in most locations. So at the moment, there isn't a national mapping strategy. We don't have a lot of capability for offshore mapping. I would love to see that happen. We've been lobbying, you know, certainly a lot of the funding that we have received over the last 5 years has come through DFO. But I would love to see more strategic thinking, I think, in terms of the direction that the federal government is going in terms of acquisition.
I mean, it sounds like conservation, the biota is driving it, not as a geologist, it hurts me to hear about abiotic surrogates here in geology, but I understand why.
Yeah.
But it's not a push within the geological survey. This is coming through fisheries.
Most of it's coming through fisheries.
Yeah.
We work very closely with the GSC.
Yeah.
We've been collaborating on the neural network we've been doing in Bay Fundy. We'd love to see, you know, some of the areas like the Grand Banks where there's certainly a need from an ecological side as well as a geological side to team up with the GSC further and see what we can do there. There's not a lot of physical sampling done there either. And the vast majority of the Grand Banks is not mapped with that data that we can access. There's been some industry data collected there for oil and gas, but that's not publicly available. So at the moment, there's no strategic strategy that I'm aware of through the federal departments. I wish there was.
I'd like to pull on that thread a little more. Are you seeing people who have stewardship responsibility saying, oh, thank you for that map, that's helping me make a stewardship decision. Here I made it, now please give me more? Or is there a disconnect between this idea that we need more mapping data and we need stewardship? And so are stewards making that connection and doing something with it?
They are. And I think the reason we've received a lot of funding is that what the maps we're making are becoming viable tools for those people making those decisions. We're certainly seeing that on the conservation side. A lot of those marine protected areas, we don't have multi-beam data. I think a lot of the folks involved in regulating and managing those protected areas would love more, but it comes down to resources and collecting that data set. On the fisheries side, again, there's differences, I think, across the different species that are being managed by DFO. So we've worked very closely, for example, with the scallop population ecology group at the Bedford Institute. They've been very instrumental in recognizing the benefits of high-resolution seafloor maps. And that goes back, when I worked at the Bedford Institute, we started mapping scallop because it was an easy species to map. It's got a strong affinity with a particular bottom type. It correlates with backscatter. The early work that Vlad Kostelev did showed that, and that feeds nicely into our species distribution models. And they've been really innovative, I think, in thinking about these new spatial temporal stock models, because for scallop, you can make these suitability maps. You can overlay the fishing pressure data because they've got vessel monitoring systems, the VMS data, you know, two independent data sets, lay them on top. There's almost like a one-to-one correlation. The fishing industry know exactly where these stocks are. They're using their echosounders. Some cases, some of our fishing industry partners are using backscatter from multi-beam to fish their catch for shellfish because there's such a strong relationship between where those shellfish are and the backscatter. So it is working. The stock assessment scientists are recognizing that with these spatial-temporal models, you can bring in those environmental covers like backscatter or grain size predictions, whatever, and that can really help you understand those spatial complexities in the stock. And as soon as you start, you know, in my opinion, that's where fisheries modeling should be going. These are great tools. They're just emerging now in the last 3 or 4 years. So that cross-fertilization between the mapping world and fisheries population ecology world have come together, and it's really fruitful. You know, we've got partnerships that I didn't show today with Clearwater Seafoods, with DFO, all sitting around the table, and we're generating benthic habitat maps. We're looking at audit recovery post-fishing, using multi-beam to monitor impacts, and we're working with colleagues in the stats to developing the latest spatial temporal stock models, integrating all this really granular, high-resolution data, and it's it can provide tremendous benefits in understanding the population dynamics. So I hope, you know, we've had receptive groups within fisheries management within DFO, and I hope that will start to percolate into some of the other stock assessment folks as well, as these tools become more mainstream.
It's a lion's tenure. Yeah, great talk. I noticed that in your presentation you used random forest mostly. Like, is there any particular reason why you prefer that over the other machine learning models, or like?
Yeah, good question. No, we have used it quite a bit. It's very versatile. It's easy to use. If you've got a lot of training data, it works well. I think that is reflected in the literature review as well. That's one of the popular tools that's come online in the last 10 years. But you're right, it's not the only one. Personally, you know, I don't favor any of these. They all spit out different output maps. They're all slightly different. You can look at the performance and the accuracy. You can really get into the weeds of how the different models are performing. A lot of studies recently, because it's now fairly easy to use these tools, are applying multiple methods and then doing an ensemble approach of your final map. You know, there's no right or wrong ways, I guess, and this can be almost paralyzing for new grad students coming in. Which one do I use? I always tell them to go back and start drawing polygons by eye, because that will help you decide which is the best way. You know, look at the spatial patterns, use your deep learning knowledge to try and understand and segment it. We're just looking for patterns. All the models are wrong. You know, they're all wrong in some way, in some places. They're just tools. We're trying to, you know, delineate and put boundaries on a map that aren't necessarily always real. You know, you look at what I call the benthic map. Sometimes there's not a boundary there. It's a gradational change from mud to sand to sand. We draw a line, or draw a dotted line. Some of these models now can actually do gradational outputs, which I think is really valuable, or can be, depending on the final use of those maps. So thinking carefully about your thematic map that you're trying to generate, I think could be really valuable, because you can pass that map on to a manager and they have no idea how it was made. And they can go back and say, well, you've said it's sand here and it's not. Well, that happens all the time because it's a model.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming today. During your time mapping, you know, this pretty large area of the Bay of Fundy, are there any areas you've come across ecologically or otherwise that are changing, you know, seemingly faster than you can actually model or map them?
Good question. I would say we don't have the data to really answer that in many cases, because the temporal data just doesn't exist, other than stock assessment surveys, like DFO go out and do research vessel monitoring of different stocks. So we've got some repeat annual surveys, but repeat surveys of how the geology is changing, big tidal cycles in the Bay of Fundy, there's going to be change. The species distributions, you know, we just don't have the data to back up or to monitor that, other than the fisheries data, which is mostly bycatch or targeted commercial species.
Is there any areas like that specifically surprised you when you came across them?
I found that the diversity in the Bay of Fundy was quite amazing. You know, the tidal ranges. So I wouldn't say there's anything specific there. There are unique environments. The horse mussel habitat in the middle of the Bay of Fundy, this patch of sand, was originally thought it was a bioherb, the biogenic structure of horse mussels. The GSC have gone out since then. They've collected some sub-bottom data. They've looked at these, and I think they're just linear sand features. They're geological formations. It's just good habitat for horse mussel. That was an interesting area. I think when you think about the dynamics of the Bay of Fundy, you have a lot of mixed glacial till material, and then right in the middle, because of the hydrodynamics, you've got this really interesting, well-sorted sand habitat, which is supporting quite a unique biological assemblage. You know, how does that change over time? Well, it's probably the worst multi-beam data we've got in the Bay of Fundy. It was the first area that was mapped in 1998, 92. You know, it's shitty backscatter. It's really bad backscatter. I'd love to go back and remap it. We don't understand the ecosystem value. You know, we're working with these legacy data sets. It's costly to go back and remap when we've got so much unmapped.
Kind of two questions. One, for the biological stuff, are you using presence-only data or presence-absence data?
It depends. We've used both. For some of our fisheries modeling, maximum entropy is a presence-only modeling approach, which certainly for commercial species, that can be beneficial. And absence doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. It might have just been fished out. They've been pretty robust. In other situations, we've used presence-absence, where we're confident that's the case. So it's very much dependent on the area and the environment we've been trying to map.
Yeah, so sort of the question that Elias was asking, when it came to you using a lot of boosted regression, from my knowledge and experience, Maxent has been the best when it comes to those drop camera presence-only data sources.
Yeah.
So I wasn't sure if maybe you guys were choosing boosted regression in situations where Maxent would also have worked as well for accessing machine learning models.
Yeah, we've used pretty much everything. You know, I like the Maxent modeling methods. The presence-only stuff works super well for commercial species in particular. And again, it's now almost turnkey to use. It's very easy to run with these data sets.
Okay, so our last questions are online.
So Guy Knoll says, Clearwater Fisheries has been mapping for scallop bed management for years. Are the physical oceanographic parameters also improving in temporal and spatial resolution for this work?
In some areas, I would say yes. We have, and this isn't directly linked with Clearwater, but the offshore scallop industry, of which Clearwater is part of. We are working with UNB on George's Bank as well, which is, again, one of the original areas that was mapped. So the multi-beam data is 23 years old, and we're still working with it. We're trying to integrate these downscale physical oceanographic models to look at high productivity areas for scallop. So we see some really interesting features on George's Bank. There's these sediment veneers overlaying the gravel lag, little fingers that extend north to the north part of the Canadian side of George's Bank. All the scallop is on the coarser sediment. They don't live on the sand material. We think those are fairly stable structures. We actually collected a few lines of multi-beam last year through the OFI Become field surveys across these sand dune features. 23-year time difference, they haven't moved at all. It's their time. We did that with the GSC. We haven't obviously mapped the whole bank. It's a pretty big bank. What we are doing though is, what we're trying to do now is bring in the downscale physical oceanographic models. Ian's Church's group have basically extended the Bay of Fundy work right out into the Gulf of Maine and George's Bank to try and help us understand why we get these hotspots of productivity. on the north part of Georgia. So we're trying to decide, like, trying to figure out, is it larval supply? Is it the hydrodynamics on the bank? Is it food supply? Is it the geology that's driving these really good patches for scallop habitat? There's these other areas that look similar on the multi-beam bathymetry, backscatter, but they're not as productive. And then, of course, you're overprinting that with fishing pressure data, which makes it more complicated. But we've got this is in partnership with DFO, so we have all the pieces now to start to try and unravel that story. So I guess in short, we're starting to address that. The hydrodynamic models that are coming online are feeding in to are attempting to feed into some of our understanding of the population dynamics. And DFO, and going back to that comment about the spatial temporal stock assessment models, that group of BIO are really keen to use some of these environmental covariates in their population models to try and understand these spatial differences.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Craig, for being here.